The judge's house. It was April when John Moore was studying for an important exam. As the exam day approached, he decided to go somewhere and study alone. He didn't like the hustle and bustle of the beach or the scenic countryside. He wanted to find a small, quiet, ordinary city where he could study without being disturbed. He packed his clothes and books and then searched the train station timetable for a city he had never been to. He found a place and bought a ticket to go there. He didn't tell anyone where he was going. It was all because he didn't want to be bothered. That's how Moore ended up in Benchurch. It was a commercial street, bustling for a few hours once a week. The rest of the time, it was completely quiet, almost like a ghost town. Moore spent his first night at the only hotel in the city. The landlady was very kind, but the hotel wasn't really quiet enough for him. On the second day, he started looking for a house to rent. There was only one place that satisfied him. It was much quieter, abandoned and desolate. It was an old, large house built in the style of the 17th century. It had small windows like prison cells and high brick walls surrounding it. It was hard to imagine a place more dreary than this, but it completely pleased Moore. He went to meet the lawyer in the area who was responsible for the house. Mr. Carnford, the lawyer, was willing to let him use it for free. "I am willing to let you use it for free," he said. "Just to have someone living in it after all these years. It has been vacant for so long that people have made up many silly stories about it. You can prove those stories wrong." Moore didn't think it necessary to ask the lawyer for more details about the silly stories. He agreed to rent it, and Mr. Carnfold sent him an old housekeeper to serve him. He left the lawyer's office with the house key in his pocket. Then he went to Mrs. Wood, the hotel landlady. "I will rent a house for a few weeks," he said. "Please help me with the shopping." "What about your accommodation?" the landlady asked. Moore replied to her. She clasped her hands in fear. "Not Judge Temple's house," she said, her face turning pale as she spoke. He asked her to tell him more about the house. "Why is it called the Judge's house?" he asked. "And why doesn't anyone want to live there?" "Well, a long time ago, I don't know how long, there was a judge who lived there. He was a strict and cruel judge, a judge worthy of curses. He never showed mercy to anyone. But as for the house itself, I can't say. I've asked, but no one has told me about it." She found it difficult to explain. The feeling of most people in the city was that there was something strange about the judge's house. "As for myself," she said, "I wouldn't stay there alone even if I were to receive all the money in the bank." Then she suddenly looked regretful. "I'm really sorry for making you worried. But if you were my son, I wouldn't let you stay there alone even for one night. I would go there myself and take down the large alarm bell on the roof." Moore appreciated her kindness and concern. "You're really kind to worry about me, Mrs. Wood," he said. "But there's nothing to worry about. I'll be studying for an important exam, so I won't have time to be afraid of mysterious things. Dear madam, please kindly accept the offer to do the shopping for you." Afterwards, Moore went to meet the elderly housekeeper whom Mr. Carnford had introduced. Her name was Mrs. Dempster, and she seemed very willing and enthusiastic to serve her new employer. 2 hours after returning to Judge Carnford's house, Moore encountered Mrs. Wood waiting outside. She was accompanied by several men carrying bundles and a few boys carrying goods, including a bed. "But there are already plenty of beds inside," Moore exclaimed in surprise. "But no one has slept on them for over 50 years. "No, my dear, I won't let you risk yourself on an old, damp bed." The landlady was truly curious to see the inside of the house. At the same time, she was also afraid. Even the slightest noise made her grip Moore's hand tightly. Together, they explored every corner of the house. After the tour, Moore decided to stay in the dining room, which was large enough to work and sleep in. Mrs. Wood and Mrs. Dempster began to tidy up things. Soon, the packages were opened. Moore noticed that Mrs. Wood had bought many essential items. Before leaving, she turned back to Moore and said, "I hope you'll be fine. But I must say, I can't sleep here with all these ghosts." As she departed, Mrs. Dempster laughed. "Ghosts," she said. "No ghosts at all. Just mice and insects and doors that need oiling. It's only the windows that open and close in the wind. Look at the oak-paneled walls of this room. They're old, they've been here for hundreds of years. Don't you think there might be mice and insects inside the wood? You'll find plenty of mice here, but no ghosts, I'm sure of that. Now, take a stroll and relax. And when you come back, I'll have tidied up this room for you." And she kept her word. When Moore returned, he found the room clean and tidy. A fire was burning in the antique-style fireplace. The lights were on, and a prepared dinner was waiting on the table. "Goodbye," she said. "Now I must go home and prepare dinner for my husband. See you in the morning." "Fantastic!" Moore whispered to himself as he enjoyed Mrs. Dempster's delicious meal. After finishing his meal, he set the dishes aside on one side of the table. He added more firewood to the fireplace and began to study. Moore studied diligently until around 11 p.m. Then he added more wood to the fire. He also made a pot of tea. He felt delighted. The fire was burning brightly. The flames danced on the ancient wooden walls, creating eerie shapes around the room. The tea was wonderful, and no one disturbed him. Then, for the first time, he noticed how noisy the mice were. Were they making all that noise while I was studying? He wondered. No, I don't think so. Maybe they were afraid of me when we first met. Now they're bolder, and they run around as usual. They were so busy. And they made unbelievable noise. They jumped up and down inside the wooden walls, on the ceiling, and under the floor. Moore remembered Mrs. Dempster's words, "You'll encounter many mice, but you won't see any ghosts." He smiled and said, she was right about the mice, anyway. He turned on the light and looked around the room. "It's strange," he said to himself. "Why doesn't anyone want to live in this beautiful old house?" The wooden walls were lovely. There were a few paintings on the walls, but they were covered in dust and he couldn't see them clearly. Here and there, he noticed small holes in the walls. A mouse was looking at him intently. Then it scurried away with a rustling sound. However, what fascinated him the most was the cord of a large bell hanging from the roof. The cord extended to a corner of the room beside the fireplace. He found a large wooden chair and stretched the cord next to the fireplace. He sat there and finished his last cup of tea. Then he added more wood to the fire and resumed his studies at the desk. Within a moment, the mice disturbed him with their rustling and scurrying sounds. But he gradually got used to the noise and gradually forgot everything except his studies. Suddenly, he looked up. Something had startled him, but he didn't know what it was. He stood up and listened. The room was silent. That's it. The noise of the mice had stopped. That's what was bothering me. Moore laughed. He looked around the room and saw a vicious mouse. It was sitting on the chair next to the fireplace, staring at him with fierce, hateful eyes glowing menacingly in the light. "Why, you?" Moore exclaimed. He grabbed a piece of firewood from the stove and jumped up. However, it jumped down to the floor with a thud before he could hit it. It climbed up the bell rope and disappeared into the darkness. Strangely, the faint rustling sound of mice in the wall started again. At that moment, Moore didn't want to study anymore. Outside, the birds were singing, it wouldn't be long before dawn. He climbed onto the bed and fell asleep immediately. He slept so deeply that he didn't even notice when Mrs. Dempster arrived. She tidied the room and prepared breakfast. Then she woke him up with a cup of tea. After breakfast, he grabbed a book to put in his bag and went for a walk. On the way, he bought some sandwiches. That way, I won't have to stop for lunch later, he said to himself. He found a beautiful and peaceful little park and studied there all day. On the way back home, he stopped by the hotel to thank Mrs. Wood. She looked at him intently. "Young man, you shouldn't overwork yourself. You look pale this morning. It's not good for anyone to study too much. But tell me, did you sleep well? Mrs. Dempster told me you were still asleep when she came." "Oh, I'm fine," Moore laughed. "The ghosts haven't bothered me. But last night, the mice had a party. There was an old mouse with red eyes. It sat on the chair next to the stove. It didn't run until I picked up a piece of firewood. Then it ran up the bell rope. I didn't see where it went. It was so dark." "Good Lord!" Mrs. Wood exclaimed, "A mouse sitting by the stove. Be careful, young man." "What do you mean?" Moore asked, surprised. "A wicked mouse." "It might be a demon," Moore laughed. "Please forgive me, Mrs. Wood. I couldn't help but laugh at the idea of a demon sitting by my stove." And he laughed again. Then he went home for dinner. That night, the noise of the mice came early. After dinner, he sat by the fireplace and drank tea. Then he went to his desk to start studying. The mice disturbed him more than the night before. They scurried everywhere and stared at him intently through the small holes in the wall. Their eyes looked like tiny lights by the fireplace. But Moore got used to them. They seemed to enjoy playing rather than causing harm. Occasionally, the bravest mice would run across the floor or over the top of the paintings. Sometimes, when they bothered him, Moore would throw books and newspapers at them. They would immediately run back to their holes. And so, the evening went by quietly. Moore studied for several hours. And suddenly, he felt strange because of the sudden silence. There were no sounds of running mice or faint rustling. The large room was as silent as a tomb. Moore remembered the previous night. He looked towards the chair by the fireplace and was surprised. There, on the tall wooden chair, sat that wicked mouse. It was looking at him with a spiteful gaze. Without hesitation, Moore picked up the nearest book and threw it. It missed, and the mouse didn't run. So Moore picked up the piece of firewood again. The mouse ran up the bell rope. And immediately, other mice started making noise. Moore couldn't see where the mouse had run off to. The light couldn't reach the ceiling, and the fireplace was dimly lit below. Moore looked at the clock. It was almost midnight. He added more wood to the fire and made a pot of tea. Then he sat on the big chair by the stove and enjoyed his tea. "I wonder where the old mouse has gone," he thought. "I'll have to buy a mouse trap tomorrow." He turned on another lamp and placed it to illuminate the right side of the wall next to the stove. He prepared several books to chase that creature. Finally, he raised the wire cord. He placed it on the table and adjusted the end of the cord under the light. As he held the cord, Moore felt it was soft and flexible. One could hang someone by this wire, he thought. Then he looked back and delighted in his preparation. "Here we go, my friend," he said loudly. "I think this time I will uncover your secret." He resumed studying, and before long, he forgot about everything. But once again, he felt strange due to the sudden silence. Then the wire cord moved slightly, and the light on top of it moved as well. Moore was sure his books were ready for the chase. He then looked along the cord. As he observed, a large mouse fell from the cord onto the antique wooden chair. It sat there and glared at him angrily. He raised a book and aimed at the mouse. The clever creature jumped aside. Moore tried another book, but it was unsuccessful too. Then, as Moore stood with the third book in his hand, ready to strike, the mouse squeaked and showed signs of fear. Moore swung the book and hit the mouse. With a painful and frightened squeak and a truly hateful look, it ran back to the chair and jumped onto the wire cord. It ran up the cord in a flash, while the light swung beneath its daring leap. Moore observed the mouse closely. With the light from the second lamp, he saw it disappear into a hole in one of the large paintings on the wall. "I will check on the annoying little guest tomorrow morning," Moore said to himself as he picked up the book from the floor. "The third painting by the fireplace, I will not forget." He examined the books. He picked up the third book he had used for the chase. "This is the one that hurt you." Then his face turned pale. "Why, this is my mother's old Bible. How strange." He sat down to study again, and once again, the mice in the wall made noise. It didn't bother him. Compared to the giant mouse, these were friendly. But he couldn't continue studying. Finally, he closed the book and went to sleep. The rosy light of early morning shone through the windows as he closed his eyes. He found it difficult to sleep, and he had strange dreams. Then, as usual, Mrs. Dempster woke him up with a cup of tea, and he felt better. But it was his first suggestion that surprised her. "Mrs. Dempster, could you dust or clean those paintings, especially the third one by the fireplace, while I'm away? I want to see what they really are." Once again, Moore happily spent the whole day studying in the park. On his way back, he visited Mrs. Wood at the hotel. She was also receiving guests in her room. "Hello, my dear," the landlady said, "this is Dr. Thornhill." After the introduction, the doctor asked Moore several questions. "I suppose this good doctor wasn't called here because of an accident," Moore thought silently. "Doctor, I'm ready to answer all your questions if you answer one of mine," he said. The doctor was surprised but immediately agreed. "Did Mrs. Wood invite you here to advise me?" Moore asked. The doctor was taken aback. Mrs. Wood's face turned red, and she looked away. But the doctor was a kind and familiar person, and he answered immediately, "Yes, she did, but she didn't want you to know. She's worried about you. She doesn't like you being there alone, studying too much and drinking strong tea. She asked me to give you some advice. You see, I was once a student too, so I know what to say." Moore smiled and shook hands with Dr. Thornhill. "I appreciate your kindness, and yours too, Mrs. Wood. I promise not to drink strong tea anymore, and to go to bed at 1 o'clock. Is everyone satisfied?" "Very well," Dr. Thornhill said. "Now, tell us about that ancient house." Moore recounted all the events of the previous night. When he mentioned how he had pulled the Bible, Mrs. Wood exclaimed. After Moore finished telling the story, Dr. Thornhill looked thoughtful. The mouse always runs up the bell rope, doesn't it? He asked. Always, replied Moore. I think you should know what that rope is, the doctor said. I don't think so, Moore said. It's a noose. It's a hanging rope, the doctor said. After someone is convicted and sentenced to death, they will be hanged with that rope. Mrs. Wood screamed again. The doctor poured her a glass of water. When he turned back, he looked intently at Moore. Listen to this, young man, he said. If anything happens to you tonight, don't hesitate to ring the alarm bell. I'll be working late tonight, and I'll pay close attention. Don't forget. Moore laughed. I'm sure I won't need it, he said, then went home for dinner. I don't believe the story of your young friend, Dr. Thornhill said after Moore had left. He may have imagined it all. But anyway, tonight I will listen for the sound of the bell. Perhaps we will arrive in time to save him.